Thank you, Ashley. Helene Cooper is an award-winning journalist and a best-selling writer. Since 2004, she has been a journalist at the New York Times, is now the Pentagon correspondent for the paper after having stints as a diplomatic correspondent and White House correspondent. In 2015, she was part of the team that was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for International Reporting for her work in Liberia during the Ebola epidemic. Prior to the New York Times, she worked for the Wall Street Journal, but of course, we've invited her to speak to us because of her book, Madam President. The book is a biography of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the first female president of an African state, but it's also much more than that. It's a history and portrait of Liberia in a time of almost unspeakable chaos and terror, and then the ways in which they were able to, under Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's leadership, climb out of that. It's also a story that's very close to Ms. Cooper, who was born and raised in Liberia, leaving shortly after the coup in 1980, in which Samuel Canyon Doe took over the country, and it was no longer safe for her and her family to be there. By the way, you can find a riveting account of her story, the story of her family, in another book of hers, a memoir, The House at Sugar Beach. Now, I don't want to tell the story. We'd much rather hear it from her. But let me just finish by saying a few words about why we chose this book as our book of the semester. If you've read it, you know that Ms. Cooper is a terrific writer and storyteller. Nevertheless, the book is at times very hard to read because of the story of the Liberian Civil Wars that is an essential part of this narrative. But it's also a story of courage and hope, in many instances because of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, but also because of the women of Liberia who showed remarkable endurance, courage, and hope during this very difficult time. And so for that reason, we thought that this would be an important story for us to hear and think about during this semester. So please join me in welcoming Helene Cooper to BYU.
Thank you, Stan, especially for getting me out of Washington, D.C. today. Being a reporter in Washington, D.C., particularly as I bring you greetings from the failing New York Times, is not exactly, the best place you want to be right now. Ashley, where are you? Thank you for praying for these guys to be attentive. I've never had that before, and I'm expecting great things from you guys. For me, this book began 14 years ago while I was on a reporting trip in Eastern Congo. I didn't know it at the time. I never realized, it seems, in the moment when something significant is happening to me. I'd been on assignment for the New York Times, and as part of a series of stories that I was writing about development in Africa. I went to Ghana, to Ethiopia, and to Kenya. And I remember with each place, I kept thinking that despite the poverty and the challenges, none of them seemed as bad off as my own home country of Liberia, which had just come out of 2 decades of civil war. Until, that is, I got to Bukavu, Congo. Oh, finally, now I'm home, I thought, as I crawled out of a small single-engine plane. After the semi-desert of Ethiopia and the savannas of Kenya, Bukavu was otherworldly lush, just like my home country of Liberia. Leafy green mountains, rich banana trees, the same luxuriant, verdant landscape that we have in Liberia. And the same sense of abandonment that came from having a population ravaged by years of pointless civil wars. Hundreds of boys trolled the streets with nowhere to go. Downtown buildings were marked with holes from rockets and grenades. The only cars were the United Nations white SUVs. What struck me most, though, in Bukavu were the women. As I drove into the city, I passed women I had known all of my life. They were old women with huge bundles of bamboo sticks on their backs. They were market women in their colorful dresses, huddled at the sides of the road, selling oranges, eggs, nuts. There were young girls sitting in front of huts, bathing their little brothers and sisters in rubber buckets. No electricity was anywhere around, but one 10-year-old girl had dragged a bucket of dirty creek water up the hill to her house so she could wash her 4-year-old sister. These were the women that I had grown up with in Liberia, the women all across Africa, the worst place there is to be a woman, who somehow managed to carry that entire continent on their backs. I remember one woman in particular who stood out to me in Bukavu. It was twilight when I passed her, and she was trudging up the hill with all these logs on her shoulders. Her husband was walking just in front of her. He carried nothing. Nothing on his back, nothing in his hands, nothing. He kept turning around and telling her to hurry up. That image has stayed with me for 14 years. A few months after my trip to Bukavu, I was back in the United States when the women of Liberia, my home country, staged an incredible power play. Defying centuries of history in the most patriarchal of places, they flooded to the polls and staged a democratic coup. They upended years of male rule and voted for Ellen Johnson Sirleaf to be president of Liberia, the first woman to be democratically elected president in Africa. I knew instantly that I wanted to write about this. So I wrote this book. It's a book about Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and what it took to upend all those years of male rule in Liberia. But it is also a book about what drove the women who put her in power. And it is a book that looks at how they did it, how these women got so fed up with being exploited and raped and assaulted that they decided the only way forward was to turn the tables on the men, any way that they could. In 1985, years before she would be elected president, a young Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was thrown in jail by Samuel Doe, then the president of Liberia. She was put in a cell next to men condemned to die. She listened in that cell as the men next door to her were executed by firing squad. Afterwards, Ellen sat in the corner of her fetid cell, her eyes squeezed shut, her lips moving silently as she prayed, wondering if the soldiers would rape her before they killed her. Hours passed. Outside, the soldiers drank and became even rowdier. Then, just past midnight, one soldier walked up to Ellen's cell, stood at the bars, and stared at her. Several minutes passed in silence. Then he said, "I'm going to fuck you." He opened the cell door, and Ellen rose to her feet, her heart pounding. But just as the soldier was entering her cell, a voice behind him said, "As you were." The soldier dropped his hands. "Retreat," said the voice. The soldier closed the cell door and locked it and moved away. Ellen's savior stepped forward into the light. He was slightly older than the others, in his mid-20s, with beautiful dark skin and a serious face. Looking at him, Ellen wanted to cry. "They say you Gola?" he asked her. "Ma pa Gola," she answered. "Say something in Gola." "Ise." "Where your pa town?" "Jalujwa," she said. Her rescuer stared at her for what felt like forever. Finally, he said, "Okay, I will stay here tonight. Nobody will harm you." So on that night, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was not raped, but someone else was. A young Geo girl who also had been captured and brought to Shefflin was gang raped by soldiers there in the early hours of the morning, as Ellen huddled in her cell. Whether Ellen's would-be rapist took part as well, she would never know. After brutalizing the girl, the soldiers brought her, naked and crying hysterically, to Ellen's cell and pushed her in. She looked to be around 19 or 20. She was bleeding, and her eyes were wild with fear. Jumping up, Ellen put her arms around her and lowered her onto the floor. In the corner, the two rocked back and forth, clutching each other. Slowly, the girl's cries softened. Her naked body started to tremble. Leaving her new cellmate for a moment, Ellen went up to the bars. There were a few soldiers milling around alongside the one who had rescued her. Hey, man, y'all think about your mom them, Ellen said, her voice shaking. The soldiers looked at her. She tried again. Think about your sisters. Still nothing. I beg y'all, at least bring blapa or something for the child to wear. Finally, one of the men left and brought back a piece of cloth, and Ellen helped the girl cover herself. For the rest of the night, the two huddled side by side. They did not sleep, just sat and rocked back and forth as the minutes ticked away until dawn, when the soldiers came for Ellen. As she walked to the jeep, Ellen looked at her young Geo cellmate. The two women had spent less than 12 hours together. One was now going to face the man she was certain would be her executioner. The other was staying with the men who were certain to rape her again. The jeep pulled away, and Ellen turned in the seat to stare at the young girl. She would never see this young woman again. But in many ways, that young Geo girl would change the course of history in West Africa. That Geo girl would become a stick of fuel for the fire of the women's movement in Liberia. Little girls don't come out of the womb vowing to become activists for female power. They don't spend their childhood thinking about how they will repair the indignities, large and small, that bleed women daily. It's a series of things that multiply and turn ordinary women into movements of female determination. You're living your life sweeping floors at Renenbaum Drugstore in Madison, Wisconsin, when your husband storms in to yell at you in front of your white boss lady. You're stunned by the violent shock of a hand slapping your face, delivered by the man who promised to love, honor, and cherish you till death do you part. You feel the warm, wet skin of a brutalized, naked, hysterical young woman as she crouches in the corner, bleeding, after being savaged by the men who swore an oath to protect Liberia and her people. I wanted to be a school teacher like my mother, Ellen said, looking back 30 years later. Describing that night at the Shefflin Barracks, she would use the mental sleight of hand that is common among survivors of unimaginable horror. She would relay the events of the night with no emotion whatsoever. The joyride on the beach, which the soldier had told her would be her execution site, the useless pleas from the condemned men that she find a way for them to be spared, the overwhelming terror of men who knew that they were about to die, the overwhelming terror of knowing that you're about to be raped, the gut-clutching anger of holding a young woman after she has been raped by soldier after soldier after soldier after soldier. That's what I wanted to do when I was young, Ellen said, to teach. The young Ellen, the Peking who was not be easy, may have started off wanting to teach, but this was not a woman who was destined for the granular. Hers would be a different destiny, one launched in a jeep by a young Geo girl who had been her cellmate. President Doe didn't realize it, but in locking Ellen Johnson Sirleaf up in jail, he created both an international cause célèbre and ignited the women's movement in Liberia. All across Liberia, young women were riveted by the story of this jailed female political dissident who was standing up to the men running the country. Eventually, after a year, and under pressure from women's groups and the international community, Doe released Ellen, but he had created a monster. The stage was now set for the revolution that would overturn gender politics in West Africa. But the men still had one more act to play, and it was a doozy. I could stand up here for hours going on about what Charles Taylor did to Liberia, but that should be the subject of its own book. The tribal war he started, the child soldiers, the hundreds of thousands of people killed, the wars he launched in Sierra Leone and the Ivory Coast. He kidnapped children from their terrified mothers, and his forces went on a raping and killing spree that spared almost no one. Once again, as they had so many times before, it was the Liberian women that carried the country through. While the men were waging war, the women in Liberia all became market women, traveling by foot to the border to get food to bring back to a starving population. They had the babies of their rapists in the forests, strapped those babies on their backs, and went back into the market stalls or sat on the side of the road selling oranges. And they bided their time. When the war finally ended, they made their power play. In 2005, 12 years before Pantsuit Nation became a secret Facebook group, and I'm with her buttons and bumper stickers sprouted on lapels and SUVs here in America, the women of Liberia held a master class on how to get a female elected president. They had the perfect vehicle for their guerrilla campaign. Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, a woman who was supremely qualified, who by far outqualified the men who were running, but who also had zero qualms about playing dirty politics and fighting any dirt the men would fling with smellier dirt. The election came down to a choice between the 67-year-old Harvard-educated global bureaucrat and a professional football player, George Weah. Now, George Weah was a world-renowned football player. He was a star in Europe when he was a striker for the Italian team AC Milan in 1995. Weah won the Ballon d'Or and was named FIFA World Player of the Year and the African Player of the Century. 2 goals in particular stood out. One was against Bayern in 1994, when George Weah embarrassed not 1 or 2, but 3 Bayern defenders with his quick pivots before letting rip a gorgeous sally into the near post. The other goal, known around the world even today as the goal, was in 1996, when Weah destroyed the Verona midfield as he single-handedly slalomed his way down the pitch, twisting, turning, bucking, and weaving all the way to the Verona goal in a legendary performance that Liberians who watched it using their makeshift Tiger batteries because there was no electricity still talked about a decade later. That Weah had no college education did not bother his youthful supporters, who countered that the Verona goal showed its own education. At the other end of the spectrum was Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, finance minister under former President Talbert, dissident against former President Doe, United Nations, World Bank, IMF pedigree, ally turned foe of Charles Taylor. She had morphed from an abused wife, cowering and hunched in the front seat of her husband's car while he slapped her, to an international bureaucrat and iconic political dissident who was attempting to do something that no woman had ever done before: win, by popular vote, the right to lead an African country. The men all fell in line behind George Weah and then complained that the women supporting Ellen were sexist. It was a remarkable display. Given the choice between a football player with no credible college education, but 2 fantastic goals against Bayern and Verona, and a Harvard-educated development expert, the top male presidential candidates who fell short in the initial election, with one exception, endorsed the football player. Weah, meanwhile, honing his message for why he, and not the old lady, should run Liberia, settled on an educated people have failed theme. You know book, you not know book, I will vote for you, became the George Weah runoff slogan. And that theme was endorsed by the failed male presidential candidates who endorsed him. Liberia had one of the lowest literacy rates in the world, so an illiterate population would identify with a president who dropped out of school, right? Wrong. What the men who endorsed that strategy failed to realize is how much the very idea was angering the market women. Those women may not have been educated themselves, but they worked day and night in the fields and the market stalls to send their children to school. Now the men were telling them that education wasn't important. Just as the men fell in behind Weah, the women fell in behind Ellen. It didn't happen all at once. Female political candidates had appeared all over the ballot in the elections, running for Senate and House on the same ticket as Weah and other men. But once the time came for campaigning for the runoff, those allegiances peeled away as even the women who were staunch members of parties that opposed Ellen's Unity Party abandoned the men and took up the new mantra, vote for woman. Door to door, the market women passed out T-shirts and handed out flyers. They slept on the side of the road at night, curled up on their mats. They walked from village to village, exhorting women to vote for woman. We as supporters responded by predicting that if he lost, the country would go back to war. No Weah, no peace, they chanted. Thus, the runoff started resembling past elections, like the one in 1985, in which Doe's supporters had suggested the same thing: vote for Doe or the country goes back to war. In Liberia, this tactic was how men managed to get their way. They simply threatened the people. Except that in November 2005, they appeared to have met their match, because the women had their own tricks that would make Weah's threats look like boys' play. You want beer? Just give me a real ID, voter ID card. I will buy you beer. I say, we buying voter ID cards, $10 Liberty dollars for one. Who looking for money? Just bring your voter ID card. The group of women had stationed themselves at a bar near the ELWA Junction, a major intersection in Monrovia along the road to Robertsfield. The women set to work, luring the young men in a time-honored fashion. Except this time it wasn't sex on the table. This time the women were the ones with the cash, and the young men were the ones with the commodity for sale. Some of those boys were finished stupid, one market woman recalled with a smirk. She was happy to go into detail about what she called the women's crafty techniques. We were crafty, she said, one silver tooth glinting in the sunshine as she laughed. Many of the young men thought that they were done with voting after the first round and didn't understand that they would need their ID cards again if their man was to actually assume the presidency. Others knew and didn't care. Late in the evening of a muggy hot day, the lure of a crisp, cold, and malty club beer far outshone whatever benefits they thought their voter card could bring them. As for the ones who were too smart to sell their voter card, well, their mothers simply stole them. Some of the Oman, when their children had hard heads, said they're still voting for George Weah. They stole their children and voting cards. Parley Harris said, looking sheepish and defiant at the same time. One market woman, who agreed to be referred to as the Oma, said she snuck into her son's room while he was sleeping, slipped his voter ID card out of his wallet, and buried it in the yard. Years later, there was no shame among the women who stole their sons' voter ID cards. Yeah, I took it, and so what? The Oma said. That foolish boy, what he know? I carried him for 9 months. I took care of him. I fed him when he was hungry. Then he would take people's country and give it away. You would get everything here to child to carry. After burying their son's voter ID cards, the women supporting Ellen then dug up an old video of a naked George Weah. Somehow, a 14-year-old commercial for cologne that George Weah made in Italy just happened to surface in the Liberian media. In the commercial, Weah, at the time a world-famous striker with the football team AC Milan, walks into a restaurant to greet his white dinner date after dousing himself in cologne. He's fully clothed in the beginning, but when the woman sees him from across the room, she's so overcome that she imagines him naked. The commercial then cuts to a naked Weah strolling across the restaurant to his date, while other white women in the restaurant drool and fan themselves. Finally, Weah arrives at the table, leans over towards his date, and smiles. When he sits down, he's clothed again, and he says suavely, "Tutto bene?" To get an idea of how this commercial played in Liberian politics, you have to understand this country's Bible-spouting Puritanism and deep racial anxieties. Many of the freed American slaves who founded Liberia were the mixed-race children of white slave owners who proceeded to set up the same kind of antebellum society from which they had fled, except this time the lighter-skinned colonists were the upper class, lording it up over the darker-skinned native Liberians. So matters of race still struck deep in the heart of all Liberians. That's why for many Liberians, it was bad enough that Weah was strutting around naked on Italian TV, but in front of white women, that was too much. "Weah walks butt naked," screamed the headline in the New Democrat newspaper, which provided this hilarious synopsis of the commercial for those without access to YouTube. "The video scene portrays white women in looks of sexual awe and ecstasy, glancing at the black man with his athletic build and muscular features, exposing his genitals, flipping, walking before them. Weah's political supporters try to brazen their way out. Mr. Weah committed no crime by posing butt naked," one party official helpfully told reporters. "Only constitutional deviants should not be elected." But the body politic quickly dusted off their holier-than-thou cloaks. Adopting the convoluted sentence structure at which Liberian men were particularly adept, Joshua Duncan Freedom, principal of the King Pentecostal High School, told reporters, "If the Congress for Democratic Change, through its vocal spokesperson Acarius Gray, can justify George Weah's butt-naked video on the International Information Superhighway on some constitutional right, then Liberians must be prepared, God forbid, under a CDC rule, to give audience to the legality and normalness of murder and even cannibalism." The truth is that this cloak of religious indignation simply covered up what Liberians of both sexes were really mad about. That Weah was flashing his oiled, well-chiseled body, buttocks included, in front of white women. Liberian women saw it as a rejection of black women. Liberian men were jealous. Either way, this was a loser issue for Weah, as Ellen supporters knew it would be. On Tuesday, November 8th, the people of Liberia woke up and went to the polls for the first time in 4 weeks. There was a real and palpable sense in the air that something big was happening. Helpful poll workers at a polling station in Cinco were allowing pregnant women and nursing mothers to cut to the front of the line. So Bernice Freeman, Louise Yasse, and a handful of other women were passing around babies and toddlers. "You won't borrow it, baby?" Bernice was grinning at one woman, sneaking a furtive look over her shoulder. "Put it, baby, on your back." To another woman, she advised, "Act pregnant. If they think you're pregnant, you can vote in front." It was unclear whether the poll workers noticed how many different women were carrying the same baby. The Oma were in a Lido. That night, a bunch of women were listening to the election news when an informant came in with an update. The official results weren't in yet. Some polls were still open. The final tally wouldn't be known for weeks, but already there was a whisper in the air from Ellen's spies posted at different polling places. People weren't supposed to disclose voting trends at the polling booths for fear of swaying those who hadn't cast their ballot yet. But all across the country, Ellen's army of women were finding ways to skirt the regulation. For Lucy Sloan, the workaround came by reverting to an old nursery school chant used to teach children the alphabet. S-O so, G-O go, N-O no. Every Liberian kid knows this chant. For Lucy on runoff night, the chant took on a new meaning. Hanging outside a polling booth, she nervously asked an informant how the vote was going. He eyed the voting officials in attendance, then grinned slyly. S-O so, G-O go, N-O no, he said. Then he added, UP up. Unity Party up. Lucy started dancing and singing in glee. S-O so, G-O go, N-O no, UP up. UP up. When the election officials glared at her, she sassed them. You can't stop me from singing my S-O so, she said. UP up. She went to bed that night singing. The old lady was in the lead. On Wednesday morning, Ellen woke up and walked into her living room to find it already full of campaign aides excited about the preliminary returns from Lofa and Nimbap counties. She wasn't just in the lead. She was in the lead by a lot, 60% to 40%. It was a lead she never relinquished during the days of counting that followed. The old lady would be Madam President. Out of the 25 years of carnage that was Liberia's descent into hell, had emerged a new leader, and that person was a 67-year-old grandma. On November 23rd, after the official results were announced, Ellen was heading back to her house from campaign headquarters, juggling congratulatory phone calls from all over the world. In the backseat of her SUV, her American friend, Steve Cashin, turned to her grinning. "The White House just called. President Bush wants to talk to you," he said, and then gave her a very secure encrypted phone number. "Call that number." A minute later, Ellen was on the phone with the American president, accepting his congratulations. Then the phone went dead. Liberia in 2005 had no landlines thanks to the war, so everyone used cell phones. They paid for that service from Lone Star Cell by purchasing scratch cards from grown-out boys on the side of the road. The president-elect of Liberia had just run out of credit on her scratch card. Turning to Cashin, Ellen smirked. "This isn't very presidential, is it?" she said. When word spread about Ellen's victory, the markets of Monrovia emptied as the women who minded the stalls at Rally Time and Nancy Doe and Red Light and Painesville ran jubilant into the streets. Go to school, some of them yelled. Don't play football." I still think about that woman I saw in Bukavu in the Congo all those years ago, the one walking behind her husband with all the logs on her back. In every way that counts, this book is for her. I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Please just, if you have a question, please come down to the microphone. We're filming this, and so your question will also be on the audio as well as Helene's answer. Please just tell us who you are and what you're studying as well.
Unless you're too lazy to get up. Hi, Angela.
The House of Sugar Beach, and absolutely loved it. I recommend it to all of you. For college-age children and our daughters especially, just found your story inspiring, and I did as well.
Thank you.
The story of Madam President also inspiring. My one personal question is just how are Eunice and Marlene? We feel like you're all friends.
My sisters are fine. Marlene and I are in a fight right now. This is my younger sister because she gave my mom the wrong medication and made my mom like sick. So she's in the doghouse. But she's fine. And Eunice, who is my Liberian sister, who my first book is about, is doing great as well. She just in December retired from her job at Firestone, and now she's planning on gallivanting around the world. She already texted me a couple of days ago to say that she's planning on spending the summer in DC with me, so I gotta get her room ready.
Okay, so I'm Isaac Bates, and in English I'm doing a report on Liberia, and the theme of it is triumph and tragedy. And I was just wondering from you if you think that the history of Liberia would be more of a triumph or a tragedy.
I can't believe you're trying to get me to write your paper for you. This is a serious slick move. It's both. If I have to pick one, I would say triumph, because I'm always going to go with the triumph of the human spirit and all of that. I mean, Liberia, in so many ways, is sort of an example of a country that should not exist, but still manages to keep going despite all the hurdles it goes through. That was never brought home to me more than after all the Civil War stuff and all the damage that Liberia manages to, in the first collectively smart thing the population has ever done, elect a smart, Harvard-educated global bureaucrat to dig them out of the mess. I saw that again in 2015 when I went to Liberia during the Ebola epidemic, which was horrific. It was probably the hardest reporting experience I've ever had in my life. And I went into it, there was all this hysterical coverage in the US on CNN and on Fox and all the time. It was just like, why are these people touching each other? We should keep them out of the country. We shouldn't even let Americans who go to Liberia come back into the country. And it was like nonstop hysteria. When I went back to Liberia, I felt like I needed to answer the question for an American audience of why it was that the Liberian people, despite knowing they were in the middle of an Ebola epidemic, kept touching people who had Ebola. I ended up spending a lot of time with people who had Ebola or who had managed to come out of it. And the answer I got from all of them was so simple. It was something that I should have realized before. It made me see that my whole premise of what I was trying to write about was stupid. But the first woman I met had gotten it from her 2-year-old daughter, Rebecca, who was crying and vomiting blood. And you show me one mother anywhere in the world who's not going to pick up their child. I don't care if they think she has Ebola or not. And, that's a really hard thing. And it was like everybody I talked to got it from caring for people they loved. They got it from taking their sister to the hospital. They got it from wiping the sweat, even though they're trying to protect themselves, of their mom who's sick. And it was so much the sort of thing that any one of us would do. And it just made me realize just, how resilient Liberians are, how very true to other people, how we share all the same human feelings that everybody all over the world has, but also the fact that the country was able to bring itself back out of this horrible, horrific epidemic where so many people killed. And they did it without abandoning the human part of their nature. They continued to care for the sick. They didn't quarantine Liberians. They didn't do the sorts of things that a lot of people here were talking about and suggesting was the only way to survive. And I just thought it taught me a lot about how people who have been through so much anyway can still manage to survive. And that's why I think that's why it's a story of triumph in the end.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ian McLaughlin. I study history here. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the impact of Ellen's win on West African politics, just sort of in the region. Did women see more success after that? In the U.S., I know a big theme of sort of the post-Obama years has been, well, did things really get better when we had our first Black president? So, how did that impact gender in Liberia, in the region, and how do you see it going forward?
I think it's a mixed bag. It's not there hasn't been a miraculous transformation of African society. It's still very, very patriarchal. But I'll do Liberia first and then the rest of the continent. In Liberia, Ellen made some strides. She was able to do a lot, and it's not just for women, but it's for the entirety of the population, which means women. I mean, we have electricity now. We have running water again. We were such a basket case in 2005 in Liberia. So she brought the country very much, she started the climb out of the hole that we had put ourselves in. One of the more particular things that she did for women is that you can now prosecute rape cases in Liberia. That was never done before, and that's a big deal. But she wasn't a panacea, and there were a lot of things that she didn't do that during the course of her 12 years in power. One of the things that bothered me is that she was an abused wife, and in Liberia, 70% of the women there have been raped. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf was subject to domestic abuse, and she never talked about that much. To me, it was the sort of thing that as the president and as an example to all these women, she could have taken on a little bit more aggressively. So I was a little bit disappointed that she didn't do that. Across Africa, she's seen as sort of like an oracle at Delphi. There were so many aspiring African women politicians who were always coming to see her and to ask her for advice. And there's this view that if she can do it, if she did it, other women can do it. But that's not to say that we have like a whole bunch of women presidents in Africa now, because we don't. I think this is still going to be a tough road to hoe, as evidenced by the fact that we're here in a far more advanced country here in the United States and we don't have it.
Thank you.
My name is Rebecca S. Savage. I'm studying political science and sociology with minors in international development and global women's studies. As I was listening to the story of the election, I was thinking about how we as Americans have a somewhat notorious tendency to kind of excuse things in presidents we agree with that we would vilify in presidents we disagree with. And as much as I love and cheer the stories of the women who helped President Sirleaf get elected, do you think that it impugned in any way Liberia's reputation for a state with free and fair elections? Oh,
you mean the whole idea that they were crooked and
yeah.
they played dirty? Yeah. I mean, I think that, but no. Wait, let me back up. It's like having your question was phrased very complicatedly. I'd love to look inside your brain. Are you Italian?
It's a bad habit of mine.
Italians always take this more circuitous route about like, I think that what they, the only time I've really gotten that question has been in the United States when I talk about the crooked stuff that the women did. Because Liberia is a free-for-all. You know, the stuff the men are doing is like so far away from what those women did that if you're gonna bring really, really pure standards of I'm gonna be, you know, completely above it, you're never gonna win. You don't have a chance. You have zero. There's no real. This is a country that didn't have much rule of law. There's no government institutions. You know, something happens to you, you can't really take it to court. You can't really depend on the police to prosecute a case. There's so little there that's still being built up as far as institutions are concerned. And so it's great in theory to think these are laws that, you know, we're gonna abide by. But in the reality, if that was the case, George Weah would have won back in 2005. And so in Liberia, I mean, there are plenty of people in Liberia who can't stand Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. And that, you know, that goes without saying. But in Liberia, but the reason for not being able to stand her isn't because those women stole their sons' voter ID cards. It's because that's a sort of drop in the huge bucket of what a lot of the men were doing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi there, my name is Andrew Ree. I'm a film major, and I'm actually from the DC area.
Oh, cool.
But one of the things I thought was really interesting, I was doing a little bit of research just about the topic, is that if I read this right, that Sirleaf was recently sort of ousted from her party from claims that she supported the opposite party candidate, who then I then found was George Weah.
Yeah. You want to get into real internal Liberian political stuff now.
I mean, I think there's got to be some great story there.
It's insane.
So what exactly happened?
So here's what happened. You guys really want to hear this? After 12 years in power, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, you know, they're were term limited. So her vice president, Joseph Boakai, was running for president to succeed her, and so was George Weah again, and so were a bunch of other people. And Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is a member of the Unity Party, and she initially started out supporting her vice president. He, as many people know, after 12, this is the case here in the U.S. as well. After a long period in power, a lot of people were sick of her. It was like, we need a change. So when Boakai started his run, he started distancing himself from the president. And his big slogan that he told everybody was how he had been a race car that had been kept in the garage for 12 years, but now he was ready to go. And so this went on, and there were all these accusations from people within the Unity Party who supported Boakai, who said that Ellen wasn't campaigning for him with enough vigor. And she said, I'm not campaigning for him with a lot of vigor because he's distancing himself from me. So I'm not going to campaign for him with a lot of vigor until, you know, he actually stops and admits to everybody he's been part of this government and blah, 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 all this stuff we've done. And eventually the Unity Party got angry, and this was part of his, I want to be seen as far away from her as possible while I run my campaign. And so he got the Unity Party to expel her from the party that she had led to victory for 2 years, and they proceeded to go then and lose.
Wow.
You're really getting deep into Liberia. I'm impressed. When I went back to Liberia to cover the elections, I was like, how do I even begin to write a 1,000-word New York Times story about this? Because it was like, you could, and it was just completely, and I got to the point where I tried to boil it down into 2 paragraphs, and it still was, it's really complicated. And what I've given you just now is the very surface level.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
I'm a history major. So my question is kind of how these stories, these important stories that I don't know much of anything until now about Liberian politics, but what these stories that are coming about, you know, Liberian politics, culture, gender, how are they? What kinds of stories? Where are they coming from? Does these stories that you're hearing that help build up your understanding too, and your reporting? I guess I saw a really great film recently called Liana about Swaziland, and anyway, so just a great medium as well. For you, where are these stories coming from besides just reporting and journalism?
It is just reporting and journalism for me. I go and I talk to people. That's like, I'll read up on stuff, and there's a lot available out there. But for this book in particular, I went to Liberia and I just stayed there for months to do my reporting. I shadowed Ellen Johnson Sirleaf around for a lot of time, but I also spent a lot of time with the women, with all of these different women. And so in this book, there are only one or two cases where somebody isn't named. I mean, I've named people, I've cited the notes, I've based everything on interviews I've had with people, what they've told me. It's just a more deep, it's a more in-depth example of just how I do my daily reporting anyway, which is I'm a much more anecdotal reporter and writer than I'm document driven. So there are a lot of reporters who are much more, they will do Freedom of Information Act and do FOIAs and, and really get into documents. I'm much more of I want to get out there and talk to people. And I focus on the story the way I see it unfolding. I try to keep myself open to being surprised, but you also need to, and there are a lot of things that I saw in my reporting that ended up in the book that I had never expected to discover. But you also have to keep a level of discipline in your mind about your narrative structure. And I was trying probably a little too hard to have a beginning, middle, and end, in an actual narrative arc. And sometimes with nonfiction, you can go too far in that direction because life isn't that neat. And so that was a sort of a struggle and a source of tension for me when I was working on the book as well.
Yeah, thanks, that was great. Thanks.
My name is Brittany Burnside. I'm studying genetics. My question is that events like these with a woman being democratically elected as president sets a precedent. And I'm wondering what you've seen as the effects of that precedent, both in Liberia and globally.
When I go to Liberia maybe one or two times every year now. It's in Liberia, the precedent is that you have all these young girls who think they can do it. I go to schools a lot and talk to students about journalism, and I was at an elementary school last year where this 6-year-old kid, I'm asking, what do you guys want to be when you get it? She was like, I'm going to be president. And you'd never normally see a young African girl saying something like that. That's not, but this was like in her entire lifetime, all she had seen was a woman president. And it's not strange to her anymore. And that's a big deal. You can't underestimate the value of that. But at the same time, globally, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf is still a human being. She's a flawed human being, and there are a lot of things that she didn't do. And so I think we learn this in the case of Obama as well, that we invest all of these hopes and expectations in these political figures, and a lot of times they can only be who they are, and at the end of the day they're still just men and women.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Susan Merrill. I'm a professor in the Peace and Justice Studies program at another university, and I've lived in and out of Liberia since 1988, first with USAID, and for the last couple of years working on a governance project in and out of Liberia and West Africa, and currently with the firm, I think one of your cousins, Jenkins, who's doing Ebola vaccine trials. And so one of the things that I've noticed over the last 2 years is a very strong anti-Ellen Johnson Sirleaf sentiment. And 2 days ago, her son Charles was arrested for corruption and stealing money from the central bank, along with George Weeks and some of the other key characters. I'm just wondering to what extent you think some of that anti-Ellen Johnson Sirleaf sentiment may result in a reversal of some of the major reforms that she did in terms of rule of law and women's rights and certainly anti-corruption efforts. Is it strong enough to sort of take Liberia back?
I don't know the answer to that. There's certainly a lot of anti-Ellen Johnson Sirleaf sentiment, but that's been the case for as long as she's been alive. almost. It was certainly there in 2005 when she was elected. It was there again in 2011 when she was reelected, and it was there probably even a little bit more when she left. But at the same time, and this is one of my reasons for being hopeful. I mean, the biggest worry when during the last Liberian presidential elections, when she stepped down and George Weah became elected, became president, was that are we, a lot of people were worried, are we going to go back to war? Are we going to see a return to this? I think one of the things that she did that was so important, and that is why I think at the end of the day, her reforms will last. She opened herself and the government up to, and the country to freedom of speech and freedom of the press in a way that we had never seen in Liberia before. It wasn't a case where she was throwing critics in jail. She didn't do that. In the Liberian press, people say anything they want. In the past, when I was growing up in Liberia, reporters were routinely thrown into jail. This doesn't happen anymore. Liberian people have become so used to criticizing the government if they want. That's why Liberia came out of the Ebola epidemic faster than either Guinea or Sierra Leone, because Liberians weren't going to stand for it, and they were going to criticize the government and point out to everything the government wasn't doing. And so the government was under much more pressure to act quickly, which is why she went and wrote all those letters to the Chinese and to Obama and asking for help. And she was going to, because the population was not going to stand for this. And so Liberians have become so used to it in the way that we are here in the United States that George Weah is coming under plenty of he doesn't like it, and he's getting a lot of criticism. And I think because of that, it's something for me to clutch onto, that it will help to protect some of the reforms that she put into place.
Thank you.
Join me in thanking her one more time.